Welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable, the only podcast that dares to be both on topic and on location, whether virtual or physical. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and I'm a member of Gestalt IT, and each week we record an episode. We bring you the perspectives of a group of industry experts about a variety of technical topics where we debate a premise, a topic, if you will. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our guests this week so that they can share who they are before we jump into today's premise, starting with Chris.
Hey, good morning or good time, whatever day it is. I'm Chris Cummings. I'm on Twitter at CrankyNetman, and you can catch my blog /64.tech. That's the word / and then the numbers 64, which isn't confusing at all.
All right, Nick.
I'm Nick Braulio, blog at forwardingplane.net, and I'm on Twitter at forwardingplane.
Kirsten?
Hello, my name is Kirsten Mende-Stief, and I'm on Twitter as Frau Stief _in_IT. If you can't get that, just look for Data Disrupted.
Vince?
Vince Shuley. You can find me on Twitter at Shuley22 or blogging on stubarea51.net.
Roddy?
I'm Roddy, based in Tbilisi, Georgia, and you can find me on Twitter as PacketStack. I also blog in packetstack.net.
All right, Drew?
Hey everybody, Drew Lentz, blog online at wirelessnerd.net and Twitter at wirelessnerd.
Kevin?
Hey, I'm Kevin Myers. I'm a senior network architect at IP Architects, and you can find me on Twitter at stubarea51 and on the same blog as Vince at stubarea51.net.
David?
Hello, everyone. I'm David Panelists. I'm David Samuel P.S. on Twitter, and I often, but not often, sometimes, I blog on rickersit.com.
Faisal?
Hi, my name is Faisal Khan, and I work for a service provider, and I'm at Twitter at M-Faisalk.
And Orhan?
Hello, Orhan Ergün. We are doing IT courses on orhanergün.net. I am on LinkedIn and Twitter. Yeah.
All right. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's jump into the episode's premise. Now, as a part of networking field-based service provider, we're hearing from a lot of great companies talking about the way that the service provider networking space is moving along. But one of the interesting things that has come up is this idea of disaggregation, of separating the software and the hardware from the systems, because we all know, going far enough back in IT, that used to be that you bought everything from the company store. IBM sold you the equipment, the operating system, the buttons that go on it, and even the stickers that you put on the side of the box. But today we don't have that, and we can actually thank Microsoft for that all the way back in the day. But in today's world, we're trying to extend that metaphor as much as possible. We want to disaggregate everything we can, because the ultimate goal is that we want to get rid of this thing that we call vendor lock-in, because vendor lock-in is bad. Except, is disaggregation really helping us get rid of vendor lock-in? I think we're going to have a variety of opinions here on the subject. Who wants to jump in and defend this premise that disaggregation stops vendor lock-in, or who wants to say that it's a bunch of hooey?
I can start out at the edge, right? Because there's some really cool stuff that's happening with open Wi-Fi and open radio access network architecture. And what we're trying to do with the telecom infrastructure project, where we're basically taking Wi-Fi access points and loading on agnostic firmware, agnostic software that runs on top of it, giving us that commoditized feel. And I think that when I think of vendor lock-in from my side, I think of Meraki first and foremost. I think of Aruba. I think of all these different Cisco, all these different manufacturers, where once you buy their wireless access point, you have to use their software. And if you don't use their software and you don't pay for it, it turns into a brick that sits on your shelf. And I think that getting away from that is awesome, because if I can take an access point that was used for vendor A and I can flash it with a firmware that allows me to load any type of firmware onto it so that it will still operate, and also have some type of centralized controller and management platform, an orchestration platform, if you will, to manage that access point as well as any other access points in my network. I think that really frees me up, where I don't have to worry about which piece of hardware I'm buying, which manufacturer it is. All I have to do is start to look at, what are the capabilities of the functionality of the software that can run on that, and are those enabled by the hardware? So I think from the wireless side, I love the fact that we're moving into that. And I'd love to see, the rest of it down the chain or down the network actually coming to fruition with some really cool products like we just talked about at DriveNets.
So the question that I have around that is this idea, because I've heard this several times from people, not only in the wireless space, but in the networking space, is this hope, if you will, that I really, really love this operating system. We'll just say it's Winx, for example. And Winx is amazing, and I really would love to run it on everything. But it's hard to develop on this Winx operating system because I need to understand how the hardware underneath works. And maybe if I wrote a thing like like a device driver for this radio set over here, I find out that this other vendor doesn't really implement that radio setup the way that I would expect it to be. But if I bought that operating system directly from that vendor, who only has to worry about writing, drivers for like 8 different access point models, it's a lot easier for them to write that. So is the ultimate goal of disaggregation this idea that I can run my operating system on any hardware? Or is it really that I want the ability to go to the company and say, listen, I don't want your crappy software, but if you cut me a deal on it, maybe I'll buy it from you?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a strong point, right? So, and I think that's why if you look at who's behind the telecom infrastructure project and you look at the money that's coming into it and the people that are supporting it, I think that's important. But again, are you trading one for the other, right? And so you look at this scenario where you want to get all the features and the functionality that you can out of this custom open source, widely available firmware that can run on any manufacturer's hardware. I mean, that's what to me, that's what the goal is. The goal is not to get locked into a monthly fee or to an annual fee for someone that doesn't support all the features that you need them to. I mean, I think that there is a benefit there in working with someone who purpose builds the hardware to support the software that they're putting onto it. I think that there is definitely some benefit to that. But is that benefit just for a certain specific group of people? Is it for a certain specific industry? Like, that's what I'm trying to look at and say, okay, well, maybe there's something better for the masses by allowing the general feature set that's available on that piece of hardware.
So Drew, I really liked the point you brought up here about, open firmware and open drivers for this. And that's why I think openness on the interaction with the hardware, it's the hardest part. I think it's the part that's probably missing the most right now. And I think it's the most important part to deliver on the promise that Disag will let you take your NOS with you, whatever hardware platform you go with. And I think we see a very important example of that with Broadcom and Cumulus, and the dispute between Broadcom and NVIDIA purchased Cumulus. So Broadcom kind of, reading between the lines, Broadcom kind of, said, no, you can't use our SDK anymore. And all of a sudden, people who have these Broadcom switches that they're running Cumulus on, they're locked into a particular version. The hardware that you maybe were wanting to use doesn't exist elsewhere on the hardware compatibility list. And so I think you lose a lot of strength there in the argument that Disag lets you just take your NOS wherever you want. And that's where I see the importance of things like SAI really coming in here, and open source, just open source efforts being put behind drivers for connecting to this hardware. And I think that if you want to see somebody serious about Disag, they're going to be putting their weight behind open source drivers. And if they're not putting their weight behind stuff like that, I kind of wonder about the longevity of that solution, because at some point, I think it's inevitably going to have to just turn into big iron, but only slightly different.
But one of the challenges that we have there, though, is that open source requires an investment in resources, not money. It requires, not only money, maybe would be a better way to put it. It requires a resource investment in time and things like that. And a lot of companies have done that kind of investment. They've seen the value that an open source software project can provide. but also at the same time, they still want to get paid for this thing. The limits of my gratitude are very firmly rooted in my ability to pay the bills at the end of the month. And so we've seen a lot of companies that will provide support for open source projects based around certain things, but really to use them as kind of a jumping off point to develop maybe more proprietary or paid features that allow you to do, maybe faster hardware access or, more support capabilities or whatever. The model keeps rapidly shifting. So knowing that you are embracing this idea that people really should develop for an open source model, are you worried that companies that are a little bit more focused on the bottom line will say, why should I give away something that I could sell, knowing that if they're developing for that open source model and one of their competitors, a la Broadcom, NVIDIA, Cumulus, decides to leverage the work that you've done, that essentially they get it for free and they don't have to start from square one and you erase your competitive advantage?
I think it's an incredibly valuable point because, once that abstraction layer is out there, well, what stops another network operating system from benefiting from that? And you'd put in all the hard work and effort, and then somebody else gets to take it. And I think that's a traditional problem with open source, and that's why monetizing open source stuff has traditionally been kind of hard.
So there's a really good example of this in the Wi-Fi space, like the fixed wireless space, where a company developed firmware for a competitor's radio to enable them to essentially migrate off of it. So I'm not going to name vendor names, but it's pretty easy to go and look up where
this lawsuit, company, if I recall.
Yes,
around that.
Right. And so they had to fumble around and figure out how to block that, with the next release of the incumbent firmwares or the incumbent company's firmware to basically prevent that from happening.
Kind of to your point, if you take it one step back, if you follow the money on who can benefit from this, and you look at where the funding sources and the resources for this come from, you only have a couple of options, right? And in the case that you're mentioning, obviously it's, you have a network provider who's trying to pull people off of one person's equipment. I mean, who benefits from that? That manufacturer. But if you look at somebody like the Telecom Infra Project, which I've been fascinated by for the last couple of years, I just pulled up their board of directors, their team. And it's BT and Vodafone and Telefonica and Facebook and all these people that are services, and all these people who can benefit from the services by making this available are the ones that are funding it. And I think that that's fascinating from the side of the radio access network and the Wi-Fi network. But is there a group of people or multiple groups of people that can benefit from the same disaggregated architecture in the network services for switches and routers and firewalls and things like that?
Well, I was going to say, I live this every day. Like I put these networks into prod for the last, 6 or 7 years. So I've been through this life cycle of the promise of disag, where you're taking this thing and you're going away from the mainstream vendors and you're building on whatever the network operating system is and whatever the white box, disag switches are. And so I've been through that and it works. And I think the way to look at this is that there are degrees of open. Like we're on a journey that we started in the 1970s with mainframes and servers. They went through that evolution and that journey, and it took them several decades to go through that journey. And that's where we are. So we're in these degrees of openness where we have open hardware, but we don't have totally open software. And the open software that we do have is generally been used by, very large telecoms, large cloud providers, and they would bring their people into it because, they can afford 500 developers on staff to go make it and hammer it into whatever they want. So, in that context, if you look at, this, to me, this all gets back into how ISPs are funded, because that's where everything derives from. If you look at the way ISPs are funded, it's very different from enterprise. Enterprises are generally yearly budgets, and I have my budget and I have my things and I have my capital projects. When you look at ISPs, it is, you have revenue tied to a port on the network, and what revenue does that port bring in? And then I'm going to do so much expansion of the network or build of the network based on that per port revenue, that ARPU that I'm getting in from whatever it is, and then whatever money I can get from anybody that wants to give it to me to go build out infrastructure. And so when you look at that and where they put money, what the interesting thing is that what really costs a lot of money in an ISP is not the network gear. It's the stuff you put in to connect the network gear. When you're building an ISP, nobody told you you're building a construction company with cool tech toys, because that's what you're doing. And so, because the cost of the fiber and the cost of the radio towers and all of that stuff is 100 times what it costs for the network gear. And so what you will find ISPs do, and what I think open networking really allows them to do once we get to the full evolution of it, is when you have a large amount of money to go build a service area, whether you're a tier one or whether you're a regional provider, you want to put as many miles of fiber in the ground as you can. You want to put as many towers and sectors as you can up, because you can always upgrade the network gear. It's a lot harder to go back through 5 years of right-of-way negotiations and redo the fiber. So the challenge is, how do I take that and go build a section out of my ISP and take that money and put it to its best use? And that's what I think open networking, when we reach the full potential of it, will ultimately entail, because I work on these projects where we look at mainstream vendors and I say, okay, I can go cover the lower half of a state in the US with this amount of money if I use the disaggregated switches, and then I pick one of the flavors of maybe not so open, network vendors that are out there in the white box space, but that are, fit on these switches. And I could take that and I could build 4 times the footprint or 8 times the footprint as I can with a traditional vendor. And so that's where people are seeing leverage. And I also think that there's a 2-part answer to this. There was a pre-pandemic answer and there's a post-pandemic answer with the supply chain issues. Pre-pandemic, white box was still finding its footing in service providers because the chips hadn't caught up with the things that we needed: segment routing, shaping, hierarchical QoS, all of these really complex things. And like Drew was talking about in the radio space, because I work in the wireless ISP space and fixed wireless broadband too. And so, they're now catching up on software-defined radios and all these amazing things that you can do in this open hardware. So the hardware's finally caught up. Now we need the software to catch up a little bit. But when you go back and look at that and how you build these, you can just build a much bigger ISP and you can get gear. Because now that's the post-pandemic answer. Is it's no longer what did I want to do before, it's what can I get? Because when you're faced with a 12-month lead time, or in some cases I have clients getting 2+ year lead times on core equipment. And when you have we have a whole bunch of pizza boxes, 1U and 2U boxes that are in a supply chain that's not been exhausted, that's what you're going to build on. Like, I don't care about any other answer. It's what's there. And that's in the here and now. What we're seeing a lot of providers do is they're moving to disag when they never would have thought about it before, because that's the gear that's there in the here and now.
So, and I think there's 2 things I think you brought up that I think are spot on. One is it's just moving money. It's taking money out of the data center and moving it out to the tower site, taking it out of the data center, pushing it into the ground with fiber. I think that that's an incredible point when you think about smaller service providers like that. But then it really makes me think it's something that, and I think Nick, you said it also, this type of technology has a good fit amongst people who want to save money in different places and who need to move money around in different locations. And I'm not sure all service providers are built the same when it comes to that, because there may be a scenario where, Cisco is the perfect answer. Meraki is the perfect answer for that organization because of management and because of support, and just because of the way that it's architected. So which leads me to the question, where does it fit? Who can benefit the most from disaggregation and open source technology for radio access networks and for Wi-Fi? Like, who benefits from this? Is it the big carriers? Is it tier 1? Is it tier 2? Or is it the small little wireless ISPs and ILECs across the country? Because it seems like all the value that you get out of it is for people. It has a larger impact the further down the food chain you go. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and I'm going to give you the U.S. answer because it gets a little more complex as you move around the continents, which I work on. But if we were to look at every infrastructure build of all the tier 1s and all the large providers before and now, I think there's an answer there where you say they move money differently, they acquire money differently, they invest money into infrastructure differently. But what's different about some of the initiatives that we're seeing in funding ISPs is that they are specifically targeting the gaps in broadband now, and not like I'm not going to go give $500 million to a tier 1 like we've done for the last 30 years. That money is going to a provider that's going to go fill the middle mile and the rural last mile and all these gaps. And so I think almost all of the money that's been earmarked in the US from all these different sources that it's coming from, whether it's private equity, is largely going to fill the gaps now. And not to say the tier 1s don't have it and they aren't getting it, but it is not to the same degree as, at least from what I've seen, of the last 30 years. So I think we're going through a monumental shift in all of the money that's being thrown around, because let's face it, carriers are not going to use their inherent revenue to build their infrastructure if they can help it. Not a single one does. They're going to search for money.
I kind of disagree a little bit, right? A little bit, because I think there's two sides to that. And having worked in rural ISPs, for 30 years, I really, I see that there's only so much that a small ISP can do. Whereas if you give the money to a carrier, key point here, who's willing to go do that, then it might make sense for them. But they have to, there's a lot of things there. Just look at what's happened, like you mentioned, over the last 30 years with the FCC and all the funding that goes out to put money into communities. And where does it end up? Well, not there. It ends up in, SBP's bonuses and all this other,
Exactly. Right. And that's where we've been for 30 years. And I feel like that's changing. I feel like we're going into a dynamic where that is changing.
I hope so.
There's some history there too with the large incumbents, right? You can go back and look and you can see, they've straight up given up, like the infrastructure in the ground, the early days of the cable networks, the original implementations of that, I think they literally gave it away. Nobody wanted it. And now they're, that's a huge portion of what provides data connectivity to, a big part of the population, at least in the North America. But if you go and you start to look at, you may have more people covered with the large incumbents because they tend to aggregate in the cities and the metropolitan areas, but there are a monumental amount of regional ISPs in North America that would absolutely benefit from this exact cost model, where I can take this money from here and I can put it in the ground. Because, building an ISP is the outdoor equivalent of, if you're going to pull one, pull four, when you're running cables structured in your house. If you're going to put a bundle of fiber in the ground, put the biggest bundle of fiber in the ground that you can afford. And that's money that they can do that with. And then they can sell services, they can do cellular backhaul, they can do all kinds of things with it. I've personally seen ISPs that have built a whole model. They've funded their entire last mile to the consumer by doing cellular backhaul to towers. One pair.
I want to throw it over to Tom, because Tom, you had kind of pre-game, you had brought up a really good point, which is, are you trading one boss for another?
So actually, that's a good point, because I think Faisal wanted to add that there, talking about this whole idea of lock-in, the egalitarian goal is that once I figure out how to build my software and I can go buy my hardware from wherever I want, that everything's going to be hunky-dory. But it's not usually the case. And Faisal, you actually had a good point about this, so I want to let you have a chance to talk.
Yeah, so the way I see it is Disag is good when you are initially acquiring the gear, because it gives you a choice between the software and specifically of the hardware. But once you put them together, once the NOS is running, once the software is in, then you need to see really, is it a real, you're removing the vendor lock-in, or is it a real, the vendor lock-in starts at that time? Like, how open is that software, basically, and what you can build on top of that software. So not all the software vendors are open, basically, and you cannot carry the NOS with you. And I give you an example, like, OpenStack, OpenStack is open, but then you have versions. You have Red Hat version, you have Huawei Fusion Sphere version. And then to get something on top of that, you need to buy their licenses, you need to pay them the cost. So you end up really the open source and this whole Disag concept, you end up spending more because, things are not open, so you still need to keep on paying to these software vendors. Like, you cannot just, put something on top of these, software. So in fact, it's the way I see it is it's a different kind of vendor lock-in, maybe it's a software vendor lock-in, not the hardware vendor lock-in.
I have to agree with him. I have seen implementations in which the companies are trying to save money on putting particular gear, so they just put white boxes and software there. But then, now we need to pay all the OpenStack related licensing if we use a special version. Oh, we have to pay now for the subscription for that we would need for the orchestration controller, for instance, if they have an orchestration controller, which we would need. Or we have to now pay for this particular OS vendor that is providing us the white boxes, because you can load another software there, not necessarily the one that comes with the white box. So now you need to consider all these little pieces, and all of them are then tying yourself to a different kind of owner, just to quote somebody else. Because then, okay, it's not Cisco's, it's not Juniper's, it's not Arista's, it's not any other vendor giving me a software and this cute management platform. Now I have to either get my own management platform, build it myself, or just get another vendor, yet another one that would give me the management platform I need. So then it's not one, now it's 4, 8, 10. So it's a game of trading which one is going to be your most, I would say, most complex pain point, because then you're not getting rid of all this complexity. You're just deciding if you're going to keep everything in one vendor or in another 8 or 10. So it's up to what is your use case and if it actually makes sense to you. Because if you're just going to save only for a big company, I don't know, $500,000 and you're a massive provider, it might not be worth the effort.
There's so many different kinds of ISPs, because if I'm a peering and transit and transport ISP, they're going to want to consolidate around fewer vendors for simplicity, scale, and throughput. If I'm a last mile retail ISP, I already have 70 vendors in my network, and there's no way around that, because I'm putting out fiber, and I've got Metro E vendors, and I've got NID vendors, and I've got all these different vendors. And, you go through these waves of, I'm going to try to streamline my vendors. And then, you go through mergers and acquisitions, which are a very normal part of a retail last mile ISP. And then you inherit 100 vendors anyway. So it doesn't matter how you slice it. When you're in the last mile game, you're managing. I'm not exaggerating when I say 50 plus vendors. It's very normal to be 50 plus vendors in a last mile ISP. Whereas in peering and transit, transport, data center, you're going to be in a much more consolidated view of vendors. So I think when you're in that kind of an ISP, you look at it and you're like, okay, so I have one more vendor. I have 50 already. But if you're in a different kind of ISP and selling different services, you're not going to be as worried about that, because and especially if you're doing radio, if you're doing fixed wireless, you may have 15 different radio vendors just in the RF space, to say nothing, which I guess is what you guys are trying to address with the open, the open wireless, the open RAN, which I totally get and support. I think it's awesome. But that's, where, if you're a telco, if you're a FISP, if you're a WISP, I mean, it's where you are versus another. And I think it's important to delineate that, is that those different ISPs are going to have that different view of multi-vendors.
Use case.
Yeah, multi-vendor is table stakes when you're a telco or your last mile ISP, whereas multi-vendor may be a choice if you're a peering in transit and transport provider.
So I wanted to jump in here off something that's been said a few times is, at some point to orchestrate all that, I might not care so much that I have a whole bunch of different vendors, but I'm either going to have to roll my own system to orchestrate it. I'm going to have to get another software vendor that does it. I don't see a way around that, whether you do it yourself or do it somewhere else. It still meets that I'm going to have to find a way to simplify the management regardless of OS. So putting in the time up front to pair the OS with the hardware that you're looking for can save you a lot of time when you go to the orchestration.
And right along those lines, what I was going to say again, Kevin, again, great point, man. You talk about if you're a peering provider, if you're an internet service provider, if you're a last mile provider, all of those have different use cases. And I'll use MikroTik as an example. You look at MikroTik and they make this really inexpensive, router that can do all these amazing things. But how much time are you willing to spend on configuring it, on maintaining it, on making sure that it's working? Because MikroTik's a heck of a device for $299, but it requires a lot more interaction than your $1,500 router, your $7,000 router with your SmartNet attached to it. It depends on what you're trying to do. And I really don't think that disaggregation is the best answer for everybody. It all depends. It's worse Sam Clements ever, right? It all depends on what
yeah, exactly.
What it is you're trying to do with it and what your business model is and what your provider is. Because I looked at same example. I looked at going on a flight flying from here to Los Angeles. My daughter's playing in the Rose Parade this year, which is really cool. And I can drive to Dallas, and the flight from Dallas to LA is $400. but the flight from McAllen to LA is $700. Is it worth $300 so I don't have to take a 9-hour car ride, to drive up to Dallas? Yeah, it's worth $300. You know what I mean? And so if you look at the same token in network operations, maybe you don't have the staff. Maybe you don't want the staff. Maybe it's easier to pay more for hardware that someone else is going to manage than you having to hire 3 people and put up with the HR problems and all the other stuff that goes into hiring human beings versus having someone else take care of the problem. So that's that whole counterpoint. Is it really worth it at the end of the day? And I think that really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. But what I do like is that it seems like we're coming to a point with this where, what y'all mentioned, where it's like, oh, the wireless guys are finally catching up, saying, hey, there's a way to do this where you can disaggregate it or open source it or do whatever. I love that we're finally getting to a point where this is actually like a real conversation. I can go out today and buy commodity hardware and buy white box, stuff from Edge Networks or whoever else, and I can put together an entire network top to bottom that doesn't require vendor lock-in from any software provider. So I think that's kind of cool.
It's
vendor locking in hardware or vendor locking in software?
It is actually, and I think disaggregation also related with the scale as well. Google, LinkedIn, etc. I published on YouTube channel also. So when I talk to them, what I am seeing, their answer, obviously they are mostly in their data centers, thousands of devices. They want to control, basically. They want to control the future and capabilities on the devices, and they want to control budget, obviously. And that's why they are supporting disaggregation and the open source project and founding most of them. So I think it's related with the scale as well, because they can get the software engineers, the capable ones maybe, most of them expensive. And also not just the software engineers, but the network engineers should continue. So because disaggregation is not moving network engineers away, so adding actually many other people maybe into the mix, but still, when we talk about the thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of switches across many data centers in those cloud providers or over-the-top providers in general, so really it's also related to the scale, not maybe smaller ISPs, smaller content providers or data center operators, they may not be able to get benefit, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways for me just about this whole discussion is when it comes to disaggregation, I don't think that it's this panacea of you're always going to be able to keep your software. And so you can have a unified piece of software that you interact with from a network operating standpoint, unless maybe you're a hyperscaler, and you write Sonic, okay, maybe then we can talk, but most of us aren't that. And so I think it's really important to focus when we're talking to our vendors and we're talking to salespeople and we're trying to buy a new thing and we're putting out RFPs. It's really important to focus on how you can manage the device, how you can automate it, because orchestration from an end-to-end standpoint is the future. It's here, it's present, it's what we're doing. It's really important if you want to manage a multi-vendor network or any network. And since pretty much all of the networks that we work in are going to be multi-vendor, at this point, you just kind of got to buy into it. You got to lean into being multi-vendor and just work really hard on making sure the vendors that you have in there at least have good model-driven APIs that you can actually model the config and have nice open models that are easy to get to and things of that sort.
Chris, I think it was you that said it. It was either you or Nick that said earlier. It's all about drivers. Like that's the key thing here. And to piggyback on what you're saying, if you have a vendor that can support something that if you look at to pick any vendor, if you go to them and you say, hey, your device can work on your software and that's great. And it can be orchestrated by your system. And that's fantastic. But at the end of the day, I want to be able to take it to my own. I think that puts the manufacturer in a position of power where they can say, hey, yeah, you can do all the little stuff with it, but here's why you should use mine. Here's what makes us special. Here's what makes us different. And, I think about Meraki, for example. It's these little MR33 access points that you get when you used to sign up for the webinar and you get the free MR33. they're great for the first year, but no one wants to pay that license fee every year. And I get it, they've got bills to pay, but when I tweeted something a couple of days ago where it showed you how to load OpenWRT onto these things, which is phenomenal because I have a stack of these. They're absolutely worthless. And is it better for a manufacturer to own the code of 5 of these sitting on my shelf? Or is it better to have this logo up on a ceiling somewhere running some open source software? If they embrace it, I think if manufacturers start to embrace this and build in the driver and build in the ability to be disaggregated by whoever they want, it pushes them into a position where they need to show the benefit of continuing to do business with them. And I think that can actually be a huge key differentiator for them to help drive more sales. Like, prove to me why your software is better than the other stuff.
All right. Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion about the perils and the pitfalls of network disaggregation, especially from a service provider perspective. And it kind of reminds me of something that I feel is a kind of a parallel to what we're talking about. And that is this whole idea of cord cutting when it comes to cable providers. The idea is that I don't want to have to pay for a whole bunch of channels that I'm never going to watch. So really what I want to do is I want to pay for the channels that I'm going to do. And that caused a titanic shift in the market. Whereas instead of trying to get your features put into a platform that everybody knew they were going to have to pay for, and you found ways to get those into maybe some higher priority tiers or something like that, you created a situation where all of the content is being created in these little fiefdoms, if you will. And in order to be able to get the best stuff that you want to see, you're going to have to subscribe to 15 other services. So I got rid of my cable bill and picked up 14 other cable bills instead. And I feel like that this idea behind network disaggregation is leading to that path. If I'm only going to be able to develop the software, or I'm only going to be able to develop the hardware, because I know that as soon as I put out this switch, that somebody is going to go download or run some other person's code on it, why should I do any extra work? Or better yet, why don't I do a whole bunch of really cool stuff that's only accessible if you're using my solution? But yeah, maybe if you want to run this telemetry thing, that's cool, but you're going to have to buy the advanced license for that feature set, because if you don't, I'm not going to let them have access to the technology that's needed to provide you with the stuff that you're used to. And if that idea makes your skin crawl, don't do what has happened with the cable company where we found out about all of this too late. You need to go back to the providers and you need to say to them, I want this and I want it to look like this, and I won't buy your stuff if it doesn't. Because that is the only true way to get the development process that you don't control to happen. If you're not writing the software for it through an open source project, you have to vote with your dollar to make people do what you want as a former customer or a future customer. So I think the premise of this episode, that network disaggregation prevents vendor lock-in, is not true. I think what you actually do is you're trading one kind of lock-in for another on a variety of different areas. It's not the traditional lock-in that you're used to, a la bundling ESPN and a whole bunch of Nickelodeon channels on my cable subscription. And instead what it is I can only find the content that I want from Netflix and HBO Max because I have to pay for those now that I'm not paying for cable. That'll just about do it for this episode of the Gestalt IT On-Premise IT Roundtable. Thank you very much for tuning in. You can always find the latest episode of this podcast on our website at gestaltit.com/podcast, or you can subscribe in your favorite podcast application of choice. Well, we'll be back again with another episode. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope that you have a good day.